Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your host, Russell Martin and Brent Aiken. We're glad you're joining us today, and we hope that you find this conversation helpful, insightful, and encouraging as you continue to lead your students in ministry. Before we get to our conversation, we want to remind you, go follow us at Talk Student Men on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook, and also check out our website, studentministryconversations.org, for show notes and other posts and helpful things as well. Also, we want to let you know today's conversation is brought to you by our friends at Grow Curriculum. So if you go to studentministryconversations.org/grow, you can find out more about their small group material and all the great things they are doing. Because today, Brent is talking with Elle Campbell from Grow Curriculum. And they're going to talk a little bit about how you find and use volunteers in student ministry. So Brent, this was your conversation. So why don't you tell us just a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so I sat down with Elle Campbell, like you just said. And if you don't know who Elle Campbell is, it's okay. But she is a pretty big name in the youth ministry world right now, along with her husband, Kenny Campbell. And yes, they do have this fantastic resource called Grow Curriculum. But we bring that up in our conversation, but we also kind of dive into the wealth of knowledge that Elle has over the course of all of the time that she's spent in student ministry. And so she does sit down with me and we talk about volunteers and how volunteers are a huge and vital part of who and what we are as student pastors. And in all reality, we can't do ministry without volunteers, but we talk about the ins and outs of why we need volunteers, how to get volunteers, how to incorporate them into your ministry, all kinds of great content. And it was a really, really awesome conversation. And I'm excited to share it with y'all today.
That sounds great. Volunteers in ministry is something I know that everybody is looking to figure out. And so without any further delay, here is Brent's conversation with Elle Campbell.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast. My name is Brent Aiken, and today we are sitting down with Elle Campbell. And you might know Elle from her many ventures, biggest ventures, obviously stuff you can use and Grow Curriculum. But other than that, Elle, tell us a little bit about you.
Oh man, okay, about me. Well, hello friends, happy to be here on this podcast. Let's see, a little bit about me. Well, I mean, I guess I could start with the professional things. I started as a youth ministry volunteer, as a small group leader. Then I became a youth pastor, did that for a few years. And then in a few different forms, I've been kind of making resources for youth pastors ever since then. So right now, that's really focused on Grow Curriculum. We're making a ton of stuff for kids, for students, and also for adult small groups now. So that's a fun new little addition of what we're doing here at Stuff You Can Use. So yeah, that's mostly what I'm doing. Dabbled in some podcasts in the past, youth ministry answers, kids ministry answers, all sorts of fun little things. But when I'm not doing that, I very much enjoy just reading books and being a general nerd. I knit, I play board games, I watch and listen to all of the nerdy things. And that's about it. I'm really into tie-dyeing right now too. So that's
nice.
A cool thing about
So
me.
I have to jump with one more icebreaker, kind of tying off of what you've already said.
Great.
Favorite book you've read in the past year?
Ooh, in the past year, let's see. This is hurting me. I can't choose a favorite. They're all my favorites. Okay, I will do my best. A current favorite is the Murderbot Diaries. It is a series of books of both like little short books and also one full-length novel. I think I read the full-length novel this year, and it is just a delight. It is told from the perspective of a robot who is designed to, murder people, but It's a very lovable robot who kind of loves humans at the same time that it kind of hates humans and thinks we're dumb. So it's very entertaining. I love it a lot.
Awesome. And then the other half of that question, favorite board game, because I'm a board game enthusiast as well.
Are you? Good,
yes.
good. It depends on the day, but I would say Smash Up is a good go-to.
Yeah.
That's like a fun one. There's also some weird nerdy things that you can get in there. There's time travelers and zombies and all sorts of weird fandom things that you can enjoy. Yeah, Smash Up. I like that one.
Nice. Smash Up is a great one.
Mhm.
Very, very good. So obviously there's so many things that we could talk about today with all of the experience that you've had in your student ministry experience, from volunteer to everything else that you've done. But specifically today, we brought you on to talk about volunteers. And volunteers is a pretty expansive discussion to talk about. And so we're going to try and cover as much ground as we can, but definitely don't want to miss any fine details as far as the conversation goes as well. So just broad statement right off the bat, what role do volunteers play in ministry?
Man, an important one. The end. Is that, you want more? I'll give you more. What role do volunteers play? So I'm really passionate about empowering volunteers in ministry for all sorts of reasons. I really feel like, especially if you have more than like 10 to 15 kids showing up, you absolutely need volunteers in your team, because you can't, nor should you be attempting to do all of that ministry by yourself. I think when we do set up these ministry structures where like we are the rock star youth pastor hero person, it's so unhealthy. It leads to a lot of toxic types of leadership. It's not the best move for you as the leader. But it also leaves out a ton of people who could be and should be doing quality ministry, and those are your volunteers. And it's not good for kids or families either, because the larger your ministry grows, I mean, even 15 is kind of maxing out your capacity of like who you can actually reasonably invest in a deep and meaningful way. So the larger that gets, the less quality ministry your kids are going to get unless you have volunteers who are involved. And then also, like, if you think about a kid who comes to church and maybe they don't have like a community outside of you and your church who like knows Jesus and has like a church background, you might be the only person that they really get to talk to on a regular basis who is like a spiritual mentor, leader, influencer in their life. And the reality is that's a really bad type of discipleship model, to have one person who is like, oh, this person will tell me what it looks like to follow Jesus. This person's faith is all I need to like look at to understand what a model of following Jesus looks like. The more that we can have a community around us, the more we can see like, oh, this person's faith looks a little different from this person's faith. And that's a good thing, because we need multiple models of faith to resonate with kids. So anyway, all sorts of important reasons, a zillion tangents we could go down, but you need them. Your volunteers need to be there, and kids need volunteers, I guess would be.
Well, and I think it's very much the lifeblood of your ministry. Like, I mean, we always kind of try to bring the conversation back to Jesus, and like, Jesus didn't do ministry without volunteers. That's what the disciples practically were.
Right.
And so, volunteers play a huge part, and it's really, really important. And the other thing that I'd kind of throw in on the role that volunteers play, as far as like you not being the leader by yourself, is the other part is what happens when you leave.
Yeah. Or die.
Well, yeah. But what happens when you're not there anymore? Like, does the ministry crash and burn around you, or do your volunteers pick it up and move on? And like, that's the epitome of like the beauty of Jesus's ministry as a whole. Is Jesus left and the disciples were like, all right, well, let's get working. Like, and they did so much more past the time that Jesus was no longer there. Yeah. So volunteers are great. So, obviously, like, we see the role that volunteers play, but why do you think, and I've seen student pastors on both sides of this, been in youth ministry for a little over 11 years now. Why do you think student pastors should make time focusing on their volunteer base? And that's kind of a divide. There's quite a few youth pastors that really don't have volunteers, and they try to do it by themselves. But then there's others that have a killer volunteer team that like is the envy of every other youth pastor within a 200-mile radius.
Right.
So like, why should they make time to focus on their volunteer base? And this is kind of a two-sided question, both initially with the building phase of volunteers, and then like why do you need to focus so much time on retaining your volunteers?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you want a ministry where you're the rock star and you get all of the fame and credit and ministry opportunities, then I guess you don't have to have to build a volunteer base. But I don't recommend it. Very highly do not recommend that. So yeah, I mean, if you want to build a ministry that outlives you, a ministry that is bigger than you, I hope that is what most youth pastors want. Then you absolutely have to spend the time to invest in your volunteers. It's just like anything. Like if you want this aspect of your ministry to grow and to flourish and to be healthy, then you actually have to tend it. You have to pay attention to it. You have to invest in it. If you don't, maybe it will like look okay on the surface for a little bit, but it's going to be rotting internally. And eventually one day you're going to see like the results of that and be like, oh no, I should have been doing this differently all along. And I mean, we definitely had seasons of that in our ministry. Like early on, when we didn't really like understand the importance of this, and we were at a big ministry as well, so like we had a lot of people kind of coming in and out of the door, and so it didn't really feel like a super important, like, you know, felt need urgent issue to like be really thinking about. We're like, we've got people, it's fine, everything's fine. And then one day, and we've told the story like a billion times, so I apologize if you've heard us talk about this before, but there was one Sunday morning, we had like 80 middle school boys, which was awesome. It was a good day. And we had, I think 2 adult men to help. And that's a terrifying ratio. Like if you've met middle school boys, they are terrifying. And a 1-40 ratio is probably, it's definitely not safe. In some contexts, it's probably illegal. And
we're something like, got broken.
Oh, a lot of things probably got broken. I think that was the day that somehow a jelly donut got launched so high up on the wall that we could never clean it off. So it just stayed there for years until they
nice.
So it was quite the day. But that was like the indicator for us of, oh, we have been investing our time in the wrong places. We've been investing our time in the program, in obviously we want our teaching to be good, but that can't be the only thing that you focus on. But we had been investing our time in like everything that happened on the stage, or like the events that we were putting on. And we were totally missing the people who were keeping the ministry afloat. And we very suddenly felt that effect of like, oh shoot, how did we let it get to this point? So anyway, if you're not investing all that time in, you're going to see the results of it someday. And yeah, so for us, we had to invest time in recruiting new volunteers because we realized, we had messed up and we didn't have that kind of like foundation laid correctly. But then we also had to really refocus on retaining, because if you get the right people in the door, but you don't have like a system and a structure and a culture that they want to be a part of, they're just going to leave eventually and maybe not tell you when they leave. They'll just be like, oh no, I haven't seen them in 4 weeks. So yeah, you have to invest the time. Even if you don't feel the results right away, you will eventually. And then it's really hard to recover from that.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, ultimately when it gets into volunteers at some point, ultimately your job becomes volunteers and volunteers' job becomes the students. And so you're kind of being there and you're supporting your volunteer base that's ultimately, hopefully, doing the ministry. And that's a large portion of what Jesus did too. I mean, going back into the disciples, Jesus was there for the disciples, and sure, he taught, he did all this, he did the miracles and everything like that. But a lot of the ministry that he did was the interpersonal connection with his disciples. And so you're teaching them to minister. You're teaching them to be on the front lines just as much as it's your job to be out with the students. And I'll say this any day of the week, I'd much rather my volunteers be talking to the students than me. Because when my volunteers are out there making the relationships, when my volunteer is at the grocery store and they see 3 of the kids in their group, they're the ones that are like, oh, hey, like, and they see them and they freak out that they're volunteers there, not just me getting seen like once a week at a football game or something like that. And so there's a lot of beauty to it. And so, yeah, I think there's a definite importance in having and focusing on that volunteer base. But a lot of people that don't have that volunteer base, it's also one of the most intimidating factors of your entire ministry, because it's like, oh man, especially in small churches, you were, or not necessarily small churches, but churches where you don't have colleges, that you have the willing college kids that'll just jump in and be like, yeah, like,
Right.
You have to go talk to parents, or you have to go talk to people in your church. And you're like, man, I don't really know how to be my own public relations person for my ministry. And then the other side of that is we really don't want to be, I always reference Charlie Brown, like the old school TV show and everything like that. And if you're old, or if you're too young for that, sorry. But you like, when you go talk to the people in your church, you don't want to be the teacher that's just like, wah, 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 wah. And so I would say that's kind of my next question, and it'll kind of transition into a few. But for the people that don't have a volunteer base, or for the people that have one, but they're really not, they know it's not at a place where it needs to be, how do you go about with the initial practice of recruiting volunteers?
Yeah. So I think the natural tendency for most people when you feel the need for volunteers is not it's an instinct to, maybe it's on stage or it's like in the bulletin or whatever, but the instinct is to be like, we need help. Please, would someone volunteer? And we need you. And so you kind of immediately portray this like feeling of like, oh no, I'm desperate. Also, like someone, anyone, please come help me. And I understand why that is the knee-jerk reaction, because that is how we feel. And so that is how we are communicating our need. But we do have to put ourselves in the seats of the people who are hearing that type of recruitment strategy. The people who are hearing us talk that way, what they are hearing and what they're wondering is, why exactly do they need someone so desperately? Like, what's wrong with that ministry that they have to stand here and plead and seem panicked or seem desperate for volunteers? What's wrong with it? So I think that's like a really just like a natural tendency that's the question that people are going to have. And then secondly, when we are like just kind of like, anybody, like, give me a warm body to fill this role, that's also a bad situation, because the people who will be responding to that are probably not always going to be people who are qualified for the role.
Or dedicated.
Right, exactly. They're just like, oh, I guess I could just show up. Who cares? Whatever. This guy will take anything. So here I am. So you'll attract people who are probably not the best fit. But the other thing that happens is like the very highly qualified people, the people you would want in that role, that doesn't seem like an appealing job to them. To just show up and like fill some kind of random need, that's not like inspiring. That's not fulfilling. That's like, okay, this youth pastor, she doesn't know what she's doing. And I don't really want to invest there. Like, I want to invest somewhere where, what I can do is like meaningful, like real ministry. And so if that's the kind of person you want, you have to communicate in a way that will let them know they are the people that you are speaking to, and that this is a place where they can thrive. So I think just our posture in general is really important. So the converse of what I just described would be something more like, hey, listen, like, this is a really hard job. Like, this is a big ministry request, a big ministry opportunity. We need you to do like, I mean, if you're recruiting for this type of role, it would be like, we need you to like mentor teenagers. That means like you have to show up X amount of hours a week. That means you have to like know these kids, you have to text them, you have to like know their families. Like, this is like a real ministry like situation. If you're saying that up front and you're making like really big asks, the people who are qualified and who want that kind of ministry will pay attention, and you'll filter out the people who just want to show up and like, check off check boxes. So that's really important. But in order to actually support that, there is also some other work that you're going to have to do as a youth pastor. You have to come up with really clear job descriptions. So if you are recruiting for one type of volunteer, you need to get really specific about what that means. You can't just be like, I need somebody who will just kind of help and who will do all sorts of things, because
I need a jack of all trades.
Right. Because again, it's like this really muddy description, and you're not really going to attract the kind of person that you want. Because people won't be able to see themselves very clearly in that role. You have to really be able to paint a picture for them. So clear job descriptions are really important up front. Not in like a boring, horrible job description. I mean, like just being clear about what you want them to do. Like you can deliver that in like fun, friendly youth ministry ways. It doesn't have to be like something you would get when you're, going to apply for like an actual job as a grown up. Those are boring. So have the job description. But then also like there's some real like culture work that you as a ministry leader are going to have to do. Because if this person does accept this role, they need, first of all, a really good onboarding plan. And secondly, they need to like be ushered into a culture and a community that supports them and that they love. And that is like more than just, just show up and do this thing. So creating a culture that volunteers love is a huge conversation, one that we love talking about. But it's a really important one. People don't really think about that really. They're just like, well, if I can get them in the door, that's really all that matters. But there's so much of like this big picture culture around it that is so important for retaining them once you get them. And I would recommend not waiting until you have a big volunteer team to figure that out. Like, even if you don't have a single volunteer yet, think about what kind of culture you want to create, because you have to do that up front, so that when these people do show up, that they're already getting embedded in this culture that it really embodies the values you want it to embody.
Yeah. The other thing, I would throw two things into that as well, is first off, I was told this a long time ago, never make a volunteer position sound like a job post on a job website without benefits. Like, don't say, oh, we expect all this stuff out of you and you're not going to get anything in return. Like, you always have to show the benefit side of ministry. And it's not like, hey, we're going to pay you $100 a week or anything like that. But like, there's a bunch of different ways that you can do that. And that kind of leads into my other suggestion, is the best and most effective way I've ever built a volunteer base is having my volunteers build the volunteer base. When you have people that are passionate about what they're doing, and when you have volunteers going out and talking, especially when it's like parents of students in your ministry, when they go out and they're talking about how Wednesday night is the best and most fulfilling thing that they do all week, that is contagious.
Yeah.
Then other parents are like, oh, well, it's not a chore. Like, I like being away from my kids, but you're saying like, this is the best thing of your week. Like, you look forward to this. I want to be involved in that.
Yeah.
And so changing the PR person from your group, from yourself to your volunteer base, is super, super efficient. And it also helps find passionate people, because they are going to find people that they trust. They are going to find people that they believe in. And 9 times out of 10, that's a knockout of the park. Like, big time, it works super, super well. Occasionally they'll bring in someone that you're like, but that's the whole vetting process. Like,
exactly.
You don't just
have a vetting process.
You don't let them just drag people off the street without you talking with them and interviewing them and stuff like that. And that's where all the policies and procedures take place.
Right.
But like, use your volunteers as part of your bringing other volunteers, because they are the ones that already see the passion. They are the ones that are already invested in the program, and they're by far the best message you'll ever get.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, youth pastors are intimidated or like not really sure how to think about leading volunteers. But if you know how to lead and invest in teenagers, like, there's so much of that you can just apply to leading and investing in volunteers. What you're describing right now is also ideally how you would want to grow your youth group. Like,
exactly.
You don't just show up at the grocery store and like, solicit random children to come to your church, probably. Like, that's probably weird and probably not going to give you a great return. But like, if your kids are actually just saying like, oh, I really love my church. Hey, my actual human friends who I hang out with all the time, do you want to come to church with me? We all know that is like the ideal way that our ministries grow, because it's through relationships. There is like a built-in trust there. And that's the same way that we would hope to grow our volunteer team. So totally agree. And I mean, even the stuff we were talking about earlier about how, you want your volunteers to, invest in students, not just you. This is just another one of those examples. Like if you know how to pastor kids, so you know how to pastor volunteers, pastor your volunteers, and then teach your volunteers to pastor kids. It's like this little exponential situation. So yes, invest in your volunteers and invite them to grow the community.
We keep bringing up Jesus, but it's this whole thing, disciples make disciples.
I've heard of him. Oh,
yeah, I mean,
that sounds familiar.
It's amazing. But we kind of have this thought to where we're breaking new ground with these conversations, and it's no, this is the same conversation we've been having forever. We just got to take it and approach a different picture frame with it. We're just doing it in a different field. It's the exact same method. It's the exact same conversation. We just have to format it in the route that we're going.
Yeah.
And so very, very good stuff. I love it. And so that's kind of the building phase. For the people that do have maybe the half-started volunteer base, how do you pour into the volunteers and make sure they're the appropriate fit if they're already there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's if they're already there and you're like, oh no, I need to actually figure out, are these people the right fit? That's a tough one because you've already got people in the mix, but you obviously can do it and you need to do it. I'll tell you the way that we did it. And maybe there's some things that we can kind of tease out there. But so basically, I had talked about how we had this moment in our ministry where we were like, oh no, things have been going badly. What do? We need to reset this culture. And so that happens kind of toward the end of a school year. And so we knew, okay, this summer we need to really work on shifting the culture, getting some new people in the mix, and also just revisiting our conversation about expectations, about do you want to be here? Is this fulfilling to you with the volunteers that we currently have? So what we did, and this goes back to the thoughts I shared a moment ago, the first thing we did was we created very clear job descriptions and also an entire volunteer handbook. So this handbook was everything from the big picture down to the little minute details. So big picture, it was this is the vision of our church. And then it's this is the vision of our ministry. This is how our youth ministry fits inside this big picture ministry of our church. This is our mission. This is what we're doing. Then it was okay, for the different roles in this ministry, here's your role. Here's how you fit into this big picture mission and vision. And then it was here's how we're going to do that. So here's the requirements, the expectations. Here's a code of conduct we need you to sign. And also here's a 1-year commitment form that we want you to sign. So you're not signing your whole life away. We're just going to do this a year at a time. It doesn't mean you're fired after a year. Maybe it does, but doesn't necessarily. But it means that, you're going to stick this out for a school year because that's what students need. They need consistency for a year at least. So we put all that out, printed it, and then we scheduled one-on-one meetings with every single volunteer on our team. I did mention we had a fairly large volunteer team at the time. And so I think we probably had 50 or 60 volunteers on our roll at the moment. That was a busy summer. I was real jacked up on coffee that entire summer because these were a lot of coffee dates that we had. It was a lot. But you know what? If we can do it with 60, you can do it with however many you have, you can do it, friends. So we printed this handbook, we scheduled all these meetings, and then we literally went through the handbook with the volunteers. And so we walked through it all, and every step of the way we were like, so does this make sense? Do you agree with these values, with this mission? Are you on board with this? And it would allow us to open up conversation as we went. And so sometimes they would be like, I don't actually really agree with this thing that you just said. And we're like, all right, well, let's talk about it. And then other times they would be like, I get that that's an expectation, but I'm really tired, or this isn't fitting my life right now. And so then it's okay, cool. Well, let's figure out a different situation. Is there a different role you could take? Can we bring in somebody to assist you? What does that look like? And so that allowed us to actually hear the needs of our volunteers. It allowed us to really get a gauge on where they were at in terms of our vision aligning. And it allowed us to like solve problems. Sometimes some of those conversations did result in, yeah, I don't think this is the right fit for me anymore. And it was like, okay, awesome. Love you. Thank you so much for all your time. Be blessed. What do you need? Do you want us to help you find a new role? What's up? And so some people left. And then other people maybe shifted into different roles, because now that we had clear job descriptions, they could be like, actually, that one sounds like a better fit for me. And then we also saw, because people were like, okay, good. I've been feeling a lot of like lack of clarity, like a lack of like vision. This like fresh new restart is very reassuring to me. And now I'm actually going to invite my friend to serve as well, because I can see that this is kind of a new, like, a new phase, a new season in this ministry. So a lot of really good stuff came out of it. And that allowed us to just, do the reset that we needed and begin shifting that culture. We put a lot of additional work in beyond that, of like kind of creating new rhythms of investing in our volunteers throughout the year, to support all of the things that we were promising. So that's really important. And then we also use that same handbook to vet new people as they came into the ministry. So when we would meet with them and do like an interview, we would go through that whole handbook and just check with them to be like, is this making sense? Is this the kind of ministry you want to be involved in? So yeah, that was a really helpful reset for our current volunteers, and also a great vetting process for future volunteers.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's super important. I personally have used y'all's volunteer book for the past 8 years. I love it.
Yes.
I totally live by that thing. We have taken that motto, and I think honestly, it's really the way that y'all incorporate the whole like mission statement of, or like our big win, like that in and of itself is probably the best way to ever have a statement of like growth for any ministry.
Yeah.
And that's that goal, or that post, their big win that they have in their book is like, we win when students take their next big step towards a relationship with Jesus. Because the thing is we have kids that have never made a step, and we have had kids that have grown up in the church their entire life, and they've been stepping with Jesus their entire life. And so there's really not a, hey, when they reach point A, point B, point C, there's really not one. And so when they make their next step, that's beautiful. But also that can kind of transition into volunteers. I think one of the things that we have to do with volunteers as well, especially when we're talking about the development or the retention of volunteers, is we have to focus on their big step. What is their next big step? And so could you talk into maybe some ideas on what those steps could be as far as volunteers, as far as retention? Because I think one of the other cool things that y'all do, and I'm just throwing out plugs for all your stuff now, is like the volunteer challenge cards and the commitment cards, and like I guess challenging your volunteers to become more efficient and more effective leaders. So talk into that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think this like this idea of that you were just talking about, of like very personal one-on-one like formation, is really important. We know that's true for students, which is why, like you just said, we talk about how our goal is for them to just take the next step on their journey. It's not to produce these like cookie cutter children who all have the exact same like salvation and testimony, right? Like little zombie children. No, thank you. And in the same way, that's what we want for our volunteers. Like we want them to fully embrace like the unique gift set that they have, their unique experiences, their unique, like insights, because all of our volunteers ideally should be coming to our ministry with very unique things that they can offer the ministry, because that is how the body of Christ works. It's, in the Bible, you could look it up if, you need some backup on that principle. But if we want that kind of ministry, we do have to do one-on-one formation with our volunteers. And that can feel a little daunting or just like annoying sometimes, because you're like, well, I just want these people to show up and do their job. Okay, that's not how that works. And so if you want to be a youth pastor, and if you are a youth pastor, you need to make peace with the fact that you do actually have to lead and invest in adults. You don't get to just show up and hang out with children. You have to invest in these people. So a few ways that this can happen. I mean, if you think about like the big picture strategy of your year, in Grow specifically, what we recommend is kind of having like these 7 different ways to invest in your volunteers, and then kind of rotating these different strategies throughout the year and like a rhythm that works for you. So there's some things that are going to like apply to everybody. So those would be like your basic communication, like sending out emails. It's going to be like your volunteer meetings where you get everybody together and train them about something. Your big volunteer kickoff in the beginning of the year. So there's like things that apply to all the people. But then there's also things where you need to get like much narrower and start working with people on a more one-on-one basis, or maybe in smaller groups if you have like a bigger volunteer team. And so a really important thing, it's so obvious, but it's really important and people skip it all the time, which is just these one-on-one conversations with your volunteers. It's so important to do that. And to have like not just a hangout, although that's important, like you need to build relationships, you need some kind of structure in these one-on-one conversations. So in our ministry, what we did was we made it our goal to be meeting with at least one volunteer every single week. Depending on how many volunteers you have, that you'll want to like just figure out a rhythm that works for you. Maybe it's like you want to meet with everybody once a quarter, or something, so that every volunteer gets FaceTime with you 4 times a year. Whatever that looks like, just figure it out, but then put it on the calendar and then do some math to make sure you actually do it. Like, because it's one thing to just say, oh, it'd be so great to meet with everyone 4 times a year, but then it's December and you haven't met with anybody. Like, okay, I gotta figure this out. Put it on the calendar, friends. So in these one-on-one meetings, what we suggest is to think about it as an opportunity to both give feedback and to receive feedback. And in those conversations, you need to be asking your volunteers like, hey, like, how is this going? Like, what kind of help do you need? You're going to find a lot of information out in those meetings if you ask the right questions. So we actually have like conversation guides to help facilitate these conversations to make sure they're actually productive. But a really cool tool that you can use kind of hand in hand with this, like you were mentioning, would be, we call them like, I think we call them volunteer goals. And what the idea, and we did this in our ministry with our volunteers, is like every quarter or, once a year, or however often you want to do it, is just creating these goal sheets of just 5 goals maybe. And if you want to get fancy and extra strategic, which I recommend, you could even take like your ministry's vision, values, goals, outcomes, and create a goal that aligns with each of them. So, if one of your goals is like, you want to see kids like, read the Bible more regularly, create a goal that your volunteers can do that can help lead to that outcome. So make them simple. Hey, send like postcards or send a text to all of your students every month or something like that. Put these little goals on there. Then the idea is that when they achieve all of these goals, they can check them off, turn them into you, and then you give them a little present, a little prize, just to be like, thank you so much. You are the best. So it's kind of a fun game. You're gamifying this idea, but it's really meant to keep your volunteers on track, to actually get them to produce the type of ministry outcomes you want to see. So they shouldn't just be random goals. They should be tied to what your vision ministry for your ministry is. And in those one-on-one meetings, you can actually refer back to that. Like, hey, what were your goals for this quarter? Like, let's talk about them. How are they going? How are you achieving these things? And so it's a really helpful way to get to always point back to like the core mission and vision and values of your ministry that way. And the other thing too, this is just sort of a side thing, but one thing we love to do is to involve our volunteers in our teaching. So even if like we were the ones communicating that week, if there was like a personal story or like something that could add to it, that we could get another voice in there, we might text our volunteers and say like, hey friends, like we need somebody who has a really good story, who can come talk about like a time when you fill in the blank, to help enhance that situation. And so it allows your volunteers to really showcase their stories, their insights, or even like, if they're talking about their giftedness, their stories of faith, whatever that looks like, you can get your volunteers involved that way. And it just allows you to create this personal plan of development for your volunteers rather than just, hey, this cookie cutter, everybody come to this meeting and good job, now you're trained, goodbye.
Yeah, no. And that, I mean, I think that's ultimately a part of loving on your volunteers. I mean,
Mhm.
you want to have those moments. We personally in our ministry, I make it a goal to where me and my associate youth pastor sit down for lunch at least twice a semester
Mhm.
with all of our volunteers. And right now, our volunteer base is kind of small because we had quite a few of them move off because we did have quite a few college kids. They all graduated and got adult jobs and
Man.
had to move and all that fun stuff. But I mean, that's
Oh,
part of it. Like you have to
oh.
have that developmental, like you're not trying to trap people in your ministry.
Mhm.
You're using and you're teaching your volunteers for a season. And then ultimately you want them to go off and serve in other areas because they shouldn't be tied to you forever.
Right.
There will be some that do or die, absolutely love your program and will stick with you as long as you're there. And those are absolute gems that you
Mhm.
love and nurture and cherish. Because they will be your biggest resource sometimes. And a lot of times they're the ones that, like, when you're in that last minute, like, oh crap, I'm stuck, you can call them and ask them anything. And they're like, all right, yeah, sure. Like,
Yeah.
and so those definitely have their place. But we try to do lunch twice a semester with all of our volunteers, and that's important. And then the other side of it is it also gives just the check in on their personal lives,
Mhm.
because life, especially the past 2 years, has been crazy for everybody.
Mhm.
A lot of different people have had different stresses. We've had volunteers that have lost jobs, quit jobs, transferred jobs. We've had volunteers lose family members. It's been a really, really hard
Yeah.
season. And so a lot of times it's also an opportunity with these meetings for you to just have a moment to minister to your volunteer, and make sure that they're still okay spiritually, mentally, and emotionally,
Mhm.
to continue on. And you have a large play in that as well. And it doesn't necessarily mean that like you have to be the sole person, but if you're connecting with that and you hear that they're having this issue that might be outside of your comfort zone or boundary, hey, you have an opportunity, pastor, come on, we're going to go and we're going to minister. We're going to have this opportunity to feed into this volunteer together.
Mhm.
So ultimately, you're just continuing to look out for the spiritual, emotional, and mental health of your volunteer staff as well.
Yeah.
Because the last thing you want is burnout.
Right.
I think most youth pastors have experienced burnout at some form. Volunteers get it too. And if
Mhm.
you've dealt with it as a youth pastor, the last thing you want is your volunteers to experience it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, well, this has been absolutely fantastic, but I do want to keep it trucking. Um, just generalize, we talked about quite a bit as far as tips and tricks for volunteering or keeping volunteers. Do you have anything else, tips or tricks wise, as far as specific spots that you'd want to do? And then a little bit later, we'll get into resources and talk about that for a second.
Cool. I would say one really important thing that I see youth pastors kind of flubbing a little bit in their ministry when it comes to volunteers is like the importance of staying connected to your volunteers, and not just relationally, but like actually connected to what their experience is like. Sometimes I think we just forget, or like we aren't putting ourselves in their shoes as much as we could be. And that creates a situation where we end up trying to solve problems that they are not experiencing and missing problems that they're actually experiencing. Some of the ways that I've seen that happen is like, maybe like you as a youth pastor, like you're kind of fixated right now on maybe like this new vision that you have for the ministry, or like just like this new emphasis that you want to make. And so all of your communication to your volunteers, all of your meetings, they're all kind of focused on this thing that you think is really important. And because you're so focused on it, you don't realize the blank stares that they're giving back to you, because they're like, I have a kid in my youth group, in my small group, who is like cutting and self-harming, and you've literally never told me how to help them. Or they're like, hey, I really like my small group is they're they like hate each other right now. Like they're so mad at each other. There's all this drama and infighting, and you've never helped me with that, because all you ever talk about is how to get kids to read the Bible. And like, sure, that's important. I want that too, but I can't even do it because there's just so much drama and pettiness right now. So I think that sometimes we can get a little disconnected from the lived experience of our volunteers, and even disconnected from what's happening in our own ministries when we just get so fixated on what we think is the right thing. Sometimes that is just like our own passion. Sometimes it might be something that's kind of being encouraged from our leadership of like, hey, we want you to focus on this. Sometimes it's just like a cool new trend in the youth ministry world that we're like, oh, cool, everyone's doing this. I want to do this. But we lose our groundedness and what's really happening. And so our volunteers end up kind of languishing because they're like, this is cool, but I feel like you don't actually know the reality of what I'm dealing with right now. And so all of this one-on-one stuff that we've talked about is so important because it keeps you connected to the real lived experience of your team. And if that's a struggle for you, I would recommend going and volunteering somewhere, like either outside of your church or in your church. Like, go be a volunteer because it's going to remind you of what the experience is like. And it's also going to give you like some really needed perspective. If you go volunteer somewhere and you show up and you're frustrated because you don't exactly know what they want you to do, or like how you're supposed to spend your time or like where you're supposed to stand, like those are really important perspectives because you can think, have I done that to my volunteers? Like, are my volunteers showing up and feeling this way? Because this feels bad. And that allows you to just kind of get the perspective that you sometimes need to lead your team well. So yeah, I would just say stay really connected, stay open, and don't assume you know anything.
Yeah, that open communication is probably hands down the biggest thing that you can have because if your volunteers feel like they can come talk to you, they will.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's like, hey, like you said, I've had this kid in my group that's dealing with cutting and I have no idea. But if they come to you and ask you the day that they find out, then it's not a big deal. You come and you got to make sure that you answer and like deal with that situation. But most of the time, especially if it comes to something that serious, it's not necessarily, oh, here's like resources, go deal with it. It's like, hey, let's go walk through this together.
Yeah.
Like, and you definitely want to include them if they want to be included. But this also might be a situation where you're like, hey, I'll take this one. This is a pretty serious subject. But I've also had volunteers that are like, no, they're my kids. Like, I want to be involved in this. Like, this is my talk. And so you go together. And sometimes that's having conversations with parents. Sometimes that's having conversations with just senior leadership in your church. I've had conversations with sheriffs, unfortunately. And it's just, each situation has its own problems and its own issues, but walking with them together through that situation, good or bad. You have to celebrate with your volunteers when things happen, but then also you have to be there for the hard times too. Just specifically, this is fresh on my mind because it happened like literally today is Friday. This past week, I have been home with COVID and like I didn't get to go to the opening night of our youth kickoff for the fall. And so I had to record my lesson, which was fine. My volunteers with me in high school, they said that like the kids paid attention and everything like that. But my volunteer called and one of my volunteers called me and she talked to me for probably 20 or 30 minutes with how the discussion and everything else went with the high school for that night. And it was just one of those things that like, yeah, I have my kids at home. I have my wife at home, but I'm going to step away and have that conversation because I'm home with my wife and my kids all day right now. And I need that conversation to go really, really well. And I need to encourage that volunteer and listen to everything that they had to say. And it was a really, really deep night. We decided to just kind of hit the ground running hard this year. And so we started talking, going through Romans. And like the first one was like, hey, we all have sin and that sin leads to death. What sin are you dealing with? And it's like, she decided, hey, if none of y'all are going to talk, I'm going to talk about every sin that I have. And like, so she like opened it up and like, then all the kids were like, oh, well, I guess I can share mine because they're not that bad, kind of thing like that.
They're not that bad.
But that's so funny. It was beautiful at the same time because like she was sharing all this stuff with me, and I was like, look, my discussion of like the lesson content, like that wasn't the star of the show tonight. You were. Yeah. And like just giving that encouragement, giving that acknowledgement that they are the ones that are in there doing the work. I was like, you killed the evening, not me. I said, I spoke some words on a screen.
Yeah.
And like, you were the one that brought the conversation and brought the life to that discussion. And so like, thank you. You are the superstar.
Yes.
And it really, really needs to happen. That kind of encouragement and that kind of modeling needs to happen on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you're going to wake up on a Wednesday night and realize that volunteer is not here.
Right.
So,
exactly. Yeah. And I love that whole model just in general of teaching that you just described, of like our teaching, like if you're the communicator, if a volunteer is a communicator, whoever is communicating, I love the model of using your teaching time as kind of like a setup for the conversation that happens afterward, and allowing whoever's leading that conversation to really like bring it home and kind of be the hero of that experience. So yeah, love that.
Yeah, it was really, really cool. Super highlight. We had a great crowd, and I loved that. And that's the other side of volunteers, is like, I had this fantastic night that I was not even involved in. Like,
yeah.
And I had no anxiety, no stress about how the night went, because I trust my team. And I 100% trust my volunteers and my associate youth pastor, and they killed it. And we had a fantastic night. But it comes with time. It comes with development. It comes with preparation. It comes with teaching your volunteers what to do.
Right.
And then you get into situations like this to where, and it doesn't always necessarily have to mean you leave, but like, give your volunteers opportunities to shine. And you'll be far more surprised than disappointed.
Right. Exactly. So. And I think, you know, when people hear stories like that, I think one of our tendencies is to be like, well, you're just lucky because you have like really good people. But like you just said, that's not necessarily the case. Like, sure, there are some like stars that we just get lucky to have, but really this is the fruit of development, of training, of investment. Like, it doesn't just happen, and you don't need to like have these incredible like all-star people in your church. Like, you can develop them. Like, that's what happens. Like, that's what leadership does, is like you raise up additional leaders. So yeah, absolutely. Totally doable. I love it. It's great.
So outside of everything else that we have talked about today, which has been quite a fire hydrant, do you have any resources that would be helpful with this conversation? I mean, obviously I would love for you to plug Grow, because I mean, that's a great resource. But I mean, you might have other resources outside of your and Kenny's stuff that you might plug as well. And just what resources do you have?
Sure. So, so Grow is what we created to help solve some of these problems. When we launched Grow, or it was even before we launched Grow, when we thought we might want to create something, we surveyed a bunch of youth pastors and just asked, like, what are you struggling with? Like, what do you need? And volunteers was like one of their top issues of, I don't know how to lead them. I don't know how to invest in them. I don't know how to get them to show up. I don't know how to recruit. I need more. There's just so many issues. And so what we did was we first like kind of relied on a bit of our experience, but then also brought a bunch of more people into the mix, and created this strategy of how to invest in your volunteer team, from both recruiting all the way through retention. And so that's kind of what we've been alluding to. Just, we talked about the handbook, we talked about all sorts of stuff. So the Grow Volunteer Strategy is like a super robust plan for your volunteer team every year. We have 7 ways to invest in your volunteers, and we give you all the resources to make those things happen. So like a volunteer kickoff event, we plan that for you and give you all the stuff you need. Volunteer meetings, we give you volunteer meeting content. We give you like tip videos that we've recorded or that you can record yourself if you want to. We give you the scripts. We write your emails for you. We write social media posts. We give you these conversation guides, all of this stuff. So it is a bunch of stuff, but not like a library of random things. It is a very structured, like, hey, do this 3 times a year, do this 4 times a year. And we plan it all out for you, and it's all customizable. So the Grow Volunteer Strategy, you can find like a walkthrough of that. If you go to stuffyoucanuse.org, there is like a little button that says like our volunteer strategy, and it'll kind of walk you through it. You can also get a bunch of free samples from the growcurriculum.org website. We give you all sorts of little goodies. So just go take some of that stuff if you want to. So yeah, we've kind of poured all of our experience and all of that stuff into the Grow Volunteer Strategy. But aside from that, one of the things that I love to do is to just learn from it, specifically when it comes to leading volunteers, is I really like to learn from business leaders specifically, because to have like a thriving, organization, you need to know how to lead people well. And I'll also say, like, I'm not really a fan of like the pastor as CEO situation, like that whole thing of like our churches should look like Fortune 500 companies. That's not my jam. However, leading volunteers is essentially managing people, which is something that business leaders have often figured out how to do well. So, for example, a book I'm reading right now and some of our team is reading is called Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And it's all about how to have honest, open conversation in a way that balances caring for people and also being really clear and direct. And it's one that, we're working through as a team at Stuff You Can Use. And it's also one that I wish youth pastors would read, because a lot of times we either don't know how to communicate clearly enough with our teams. And so we kind of leave people, uncertain of what we want from them. Or we might communicate clearly, but we're kind of a jerk, and that's also not good. So finding that balance, this book is just kind of focused on that. So anyway, all that to say, stretch your brains a little bit and learn from some people who are in different fields, who have something that they can, really offer to this conversation. That's just one. I'm sure there's tons more that could be used, but that's one that we really like right now.
Perfect. Yeah. And I mean, as far as your interpersonal leadership, there are so many things. We did a podcast just a couple of weeks ago with Mark Ostreicher, and he is a leadership development guru. Yeah. But then also there are so many Christian circle leadership podcasts to listen to. Craig Groeschel, Carey Nieuwhof, so many great minds that always just have great content when it comes to leadership development, specifically of yourself, so you can be a better leader for your volunteers. And it's all great stuff. I can't highlight their stuff enough. And then obviously also I've personally used Grow Curriculum. I know a lot of different people that have used it as well. And if you don't have Grow, we will have a link in the show notes from this podcast where you can click and you can register for that yourself. They have a couple different tiers of pricing and everything like that you can go into and look at. But if you don't have it, you should definitely check it out. There's a link in the show notes for this podcast. And they make some absolutely great stuff. Well, last minute, do y'all have any shameless plugs or anything else that you want to throw out there that you might have working on or anything like that?
Yeah, I'll give a couple shameless plugs. We just released a couple brand new things that we're super excited about. So Grow Groups is our new adult small group curriculum. It's video based, but we also give you the video scripts in case you want to film it yourself and not use our videos. You can do whatever you want. So we have Grow Groups, and it also aligns with our kids and student curriculum, which is really fun. So we've got that. And then we also just released something called Hubs, which is kind of like, it's a communication tool that you can use with your volunteers, but you can also use it with parents, with students, with all sorts of things. Picture kind of like Slack for your ministry, but also with like announcement and calendar functionality, so that, your parents or your volunteers can log in and they can see everything that's coming up in your ministry. They can ask questions. You guys can have conversations there. Check out Hubs from Stuff You Can Use. You can find it at hubs.stuffyoucanuse.org. You can find Grow Groups curriculum at growcurriculum.org. And we have some other, little surprises up our sleeves. So got some more things coming in the next few months.
Fantastic. Y'all always have stuff coming down the pipe. So it's always fun to watch and hear what's going on. And I mean, like I said, I've been in youth ministry for, like I said, a little over 11 years now. And I've seen from the get-go of y'all's stuff with Orange to stuff you can use to grow now. All great stuff. I've used quite a bit of it myself.
Nice.
So fantastic stuff. Thank you for being on the show. We definitely
you.
appreciate it. And like we've talked, we might have you back on for a recurring guest episode down the road, because there's so many things that you and Kenny do well. And yeah, just great content today. Really good conversation. And I'm excited to hear what people think about it. So with nothing else, we will see you guys next week as we close this week's show, and y'all have a great week.
Hey, that was great. And I hope you found some things that you can learn and pull from that as you continue to pour into the lives of your students.
Yeah, if you enjoyed this episode today and found it helpful, I'd ask that you leave a comment or a rating on whatever platform you're listening on. We would appreciate that a lot. But also, maybe you know someone that would benefit from this conversation. Take a moment and share this episode with them on social media and tag them. But then also go ahead and do us a favor and tag us as well at Talk Student Men on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Now, Russell, you have next week's episode. So what do we have in store for the podcast next week?
Yes, I talked with Kyle Creel, and Kyle is the leader of Small Town Youth Ministry podcast, where he does a monthly podcast based on how to help those in doing ministry in small churches and small towns. And so we're going to talk a lot about how do you adapt big concepts for small church. So you may read a book, or you may see that such and such church, big church is doing this, or you may go to a conference or hear a podcast or an article or something about a church doing, with all the lights and all the games and all the budget and all the money. And it would be easy to look at that and go, well, we can't do that. We can't learn anything. So we're actually going to look at how do you take some of those big idea concepts and pull out what would be useful for small churches. What are the things we can learn and can do instead of dismissing? How do we make them applicable to what we are doing? And so I'm really looking forward to that. And I think it'll be helpful for a lot of our listeners.
Yeah, that sounds great. I can't wait to hear the conversation next week. Just a quick reminder once again, be sure to go to studentministryconversations.org for show notes and links from this episode and all the other episodes that we've done. Just search for this week's episode number in the search bar. And we also have other helpful articles and blog posts as well. And then don't forget to check out Grow Curriculum, who sponsored this podcast. You can check them out, and you can support our podcast at the same time by using our link to make any purchases on their site. And that link is studentministryconversations.org/grow. Again, thank you guys for joining us this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.